All right, thank you for coming back to the lecture. So now we're going to talk about what types of validity there that are out there uh, and important to good study design. First is statistical conclusion validity. We'll talk about internal validity, construct validity, and external validity. So what is statistical conclusion validity? Well, this is when we're inferring causation or relationships between independent and dependent variables, we do that through statistical analysis, and that's certainly one of our goals of this course for you all is to have a greater understanding and appreciation for the various statistical analyses or techniques which are reported in the literature that you're going to read and appraise. Um, and it's looking at whether the conclusions about the relationships or differences are accurate reflection of the real world. And so that's why we need to use statistics to help us um, determine those differences or relationships. There's threats to statistical conclusion validity. The most common being is you can have a low statistical power, meaning you don't have a lot. The investigator has not designed a study with a large enough sample size to detect the difference, and we'll talk about that in later weeks. For example, you may have heard of the term a type 2 error, which is meaning you find no difference when there is actually a difference. So a type 2 error may be that, hey, you're not pregnant, and she actually really is pregnant. So the other thing to go along when you have threats to statistical conclusion validity is where there may be a violation of what we call a statistical test assumptions. All of the statistical tests that we'll talk about in later weeks have certain underlying assumptions about the data that is being analyzed. For example, or not only the type of data you use, but there's also additional requirements that investigators or data analysts have to consider to be able to make sure that they can appropriately use that statistical test. For example, you could not use a t-test, which looks at interval level data or like continuous data, for nominal data, meaning you couldn't use a t-test to compare differences, you know, um, with nominal data, like compare men and women. But you could do men and women and look at differences in pain scores, and that would be appropriate. So you have to make sure the statistical test is appropriate for the level of data that you're, you're analyzing. It's also you don't want to. Investigators sometimes get into issues of what they call fishing or running multiple statistical tests, and this will actually increase the chances of what's called a type 1 error, meaning that you find a difference or a false positive, but you find a difference when in fact there is no difference at all. Um, and some of the multivariate statistical analyses that can be conducted can help minimize this risk. Also, sometimes you'll read in manuscripts that authors, instead of choosing the p-value of 0.05, maybe they choose a much more conservative level of 0.01 to be considered statistically significant, to control for to ensure that they have validity with their statistical findings. Some other factors that go into statistical conclusion validity is the reliability of the measures. Is the instrument measuring what it's supposed to measure? Is the treatment been standardized? Are they doing it the same way? Sometimes there can be random irrelevancies in experimental settings that can interfere with the conclusions we draw from our statistical analyses. Um, Also, there can be some heterogeneity in how respondents uh, act or respond to our interventions. Not every patient responds the same way to some sort of intervention or treatment, and that can impact the conclusions we draw or the validity of our statistical findings or results from our statistical tests, I should say. Internal validity. So studies that have high internal validity have designs and methods that are sensitive enough to detect, measure, and control for the true relationship between the independent and dependent variable, or the treatment and the outcome. And they can, and studies with strong internal validity minimize the impact of what we call extraneous or confounding variables. So that's something you have to look for. So what are some threats to internal validity? Uh, One is history, maturation, testing, instrumentation, statistical regression, mortality, and there can be an interaction of all of the above. And we're going to talk about each of these here in just a few minutes. And you can see the figure I have on the right side of the screen. So say you have some sort of program or intervention, what you're doing, and then maybe it's a randomized control trial that you're doing, and you're hypothesizing that whatever you do causes what you see. The problem is there can be a numerous alternative causes that could impact those observations that could interfere with the internal validity of that study. One threat is that history. This is where events external to the intervention may affect the outcome. For example, maybe there's a study that's looking at preoperative anxiety, and maybe some patients were getting some sort of a educational process, to maybe help decrease their anxiety, or maybe there was some guided imagery intervention that was going on that patients were randomized to. And then all of a sudden the nurses come in and they change that screening process, and maybe that impacts how the data was collected on the preoperative anxiety. Maybe that change impacts the process, and that in turn has an impact on your outcomes. Maturation is normal physiological or psychological changes that occur during the study which may affect the outcome. The classic example may be aging of subjects in a longitudinal study. The effect that you found wasn't necessarily due to the intervention, but it was due to these people just getting older. Testing is another threat, and this is where a pretreatment or a pretest may alter subsequent measures regardless of the intervention. For example, I completed the depression scale at baseline and I repeated it later, but I knew what the questions were like when I first answered them, so I ended up answering them differently because I was concerned, but it wasn't really due to the intervention causing the differences in the scores. Instrumentation is where there's inconsistencies with the testing or measurement of an instrument, including the individuals using or those who administer it. And this may be where there's variation. Say you have research coordinators and maybe you have multiple on a study. It may be how the data was collected by one of the coordinators was different enough from another one to lead to some inconsistencies with how that data was collected, and that could impact the internal validity of that study. Statistical regression is just a natural tendency for people who score, who are measured at the extremes in the initial, to move closer to the mean when subsequently retested. Mortality, this is actually just what it says, that subjects could maybe die. They also more commonly may drop out, or what we call attrite, from a study, and there may be differences in those who dropped out may differ from those who complete the study. And this is a very common problem in longitudinal studies, and investigators really need to adjust that in their results, and they should be reporting the number of subjects that were enrolled and that completed, and if they were lost, why were they lost. And sometimes, in some cases, they'll even do a subgroup analysis to look at differences. Another threat is selection bias, where maybe there's differences either known or unknown between the subjects that exist before the start of the study, and there could be a combination of any of the above. So here is an example from a study that I did with some of my students a few years ago. You can read it in the ANA Journal in 2016. In this study, we examined the effect of a 30 cc normal saline bolus on time to full motor recovery in parturients who received patient-controlled epidural analgesia with a dilute local anesthetic. And this was actually a follow-up study to our to original work that another group of our students had done. But what I did is I highlighted in our introduction and background review of the literature to set the stage for why we were doing this second study, you can see what I've highlighted down below, and I'll read it to you. So, what it says here is, however, investigators did not measure time to full metal recovery. Additionally, the experimental group had a higher baseline sensory dermatome level, which may have biased the results. Additionally, subjects and data collectors were not blinded to group assignment. Well, what type of threat to internal validity do you suspect that this study has? You can pause this video, go back and look at the threats to internal validity if you like. All right, it actually was selection bias. And what we had found in this particular first study we had done was that they, in fact, did have a higher sensory dermatome level. And so when we designed the subsequent study, we made sure we controlled for those factors um, so that we could have a very strong internal validity for our study findings. All right, I'm going to pause the video now, and then when you're ready, you can continue with the next part of the lecture.